everybody, I'm Sean. In today's video I want to talk about 5 common trauma responses that you basically have as a reaction to your trauma or your past or traumatic events that you may have went through, or maybe even trauma that is ongoing right now in your life. And it's very powerful to know these trauma responses. Obviously, I'm not going to name every single trauma response, but it's very important just to know your type of responses and how you're acting in reaction to your trauma, because that essentially is not the real you. That is not who you are. You're not making the choices you actually want to make, because your trauma is essentially becoming your life and taking completely over when you're reacting in a way to your trauma, because you're just making all your life choices and living your life all in a reaction to your trauma, which is essentially identifying as the trauma. And essentially that is a self-blaming mechanism that you have that is perceived as basically a defense mechanism to basically not face and actually heal. So we get far away from normality during trauma, and especially in post-life of our traumatic events or traumatic childhood or traumatic past. We don't understand normality when we try to fight our pain, or don't want to accept our pain, or don't want to accept that we've been through everything, right? Or anything at all. We just want to accept that what we went through is basically normal, right? And that is essentially a reaction to trauma, right? Just not wanting to accept it, not wanting to face it, right? A lot of us have pain that is so harsh that the human mind can't even handle it, but that's okay. But that does not mean that you should just take all your pain and just ball it up and push it down deep inside your body, or deep inside your brain and into your subconscious, which is essentially how the reactions are created. Because when you know how you react, that can be a form of identifying your pain. Because if you know how you're reacting, right, and why you're reacting in that way, then the only way to figure out how you're reacting is to find the roots, right? There's no point of healing pain if you're not finding the roots of the pain. In trauma, when you're recovering from trauma, the root of the pain is not your depression, it's not your anxiety, it's not your PTSD. All that is just an after effect. The root of your pain and your suffering is your trauma, right? So why are you reacting, right, in certain ways? Because of your trauma. That's why it's called a trauma reaction or trauma response, because you're reacting from the trauma, right? So why do you do certain things? Why do you have coping mechanisms that feels like you don't even have to think about, you just do, and then you realize, damn, I'm doing this. How do I even know how to do this? How do I even know how to watch porn? How do I even know how to smoke weed? But you just know how to do it because it's just your trauma taking over, right? So when you realize how you're reacting, you identify your pain because you're taking some control back, right? And the only way to know why you're reacting in a certain way is by identifying the trauma. The only reason to know why you are depressed or why you have PTSD is by identifying your trauma and identifying your pain. And that's essentially facing it, not in a forceful way, overstimulating way, but facing it with peace. So by identifying your pain, you can allow yourself to heal. So what is the first common trauma response that most people have when they're dealing with childhood trauma in their adult life, or just a traumatic event that may have just happened and they're dealing with all this pain? What is a common trauma response to this type of pain that a lot of humans deal with on a regular basis? Now, the first common trauma response I'm about to talk about is 3 different type of trauma responses, but I consider these to be in a form of a bubble because they all can relate to each other. This first common trauma response is called the fight, flight, or freeze trauma responses, because a lot of times when we have pain, like I said, we don't want to face it, right? But sometimes we just don't want to accept it, right? We want to think that this is normal, right? What we're going through is normal. We don't want to separate from that pain. We want to identify with that pain because we choose that because we don't know anything else, right? Because we let our pain and let our life that we're living when the trauma is ongoing to become a normality. We let our depression become a normality, our coping mechanisms to become a normality. The people in our life who are causing our trauma to become a normality, right? You don't want to see your family members or your partner as an abuser, right? Because there's someone that you think that you should love, right? So you're taking traditional normality and just mixing it up with what's not normal just to make what's not normal normal, right? And that's how a lot of times during pain you end up thinking what's right is what's wrong is right. When we're fighting this pain, right, we're just trying to not accept it, like I said. But a lot of times, as we fight so much and the wall just keeps coming back for us, like I've said in my past videos, the wall just keeps coming back for us. Everything just keeps coming back for us. Our pain keeps coming back for us no matter how hard we fight to get rid of it, because essentially fighting it, the more and more you fight it, the more and more it will come back for you, because you're never actually healing. You're always just clashing. Right? You're always fighting fire with water. There'll always be something messy going on. So when we stop fighting, a lot of times we still don't heal, right? It's a wall that keeps coming back for you. So a lot of times, now that we realize we can't fight, we flight and we run away from our problems, right? That's how coping mechanisms are created, right? We don't want to fight this pain. We don't want to face it, right? Because we realize that's not doing shit and it hurts more. Because it does, because you're not actually healing, right? That's basically the opposite of healing, and the opposite of healing will definitely hurt and cause more pain probably. But when we stop fighting, right, we flight, we run away. We do things to distract ourselves in a way that is not healthy, because sometimes you do need a distraction. You shouldn't be focused on your pain 24/7. That's like being in therapy 24 hours of the day. Even people who are at an intervention have breaks. Right? They might be going through group therapy, individual therapy, all that, but they don't have it every single moment of the day. Like, it's okay to chill and just be normal, right? And just be laid back, right? Because if you're truly in a safe place, right, but the pain is still coming back for you and you're worried something is gonna happen, 9 times out of 10, that's just your mind messing with you, right? Because that's the whole point of therapy, really. You know that you're in a safe place now. A lot of times what happens in therapy, when we talk about this, we still don't trust the therapist sometimes. Because one, you guys just may have not made that connection yet in the intermediate space, or you just are letting your trauma make you react in a way towards your therapist. Because that's supposed to be your safe place where you talk about it, but you're afraid something will still happen, right? And so you run away, right? You stop doing therapy. A lot of us don't want to do therapy, or it's too much for us to handle, right? So we don't want to face it, right? Because we don't want to accept our truth. It hurts too much, right? But the only way to get over that pain is to actually embrace it, not run away, not fight it, just to destruct it down bit by bit, just like solving a puzzle and then unsolving it piece by piece, rewinding all your little steps and relearning and putting it all back together in the actual right way, right? That's essentially how your brain is rewired, right? But when we can't fight, right, because you can only fight and fight so much, sometimes we just freeze. Sometimes we don't know what to do. A lot of us are numb. We can't get out of bed. We don't do shit with our life, right? Because a lot of times when you're fighting, you're doing basically the opposite, right? Even though you're trying to just fight it, right, you end up just doing the opposite of what you want to do, right? What you really want to do. Because that's just a reaction to your trauma, right? So if this happened in your trauma and you actually love doing this thing, but your trauma affected you in it, and now when you try to do it post-life after your trauma, you don't want to do it at all. You don't even want to think about it. You don't even want to see it. It's too much of a trigger, because that's essentially running away. All these are forms of running away, but sometimes we freeze, right? We don't know what to do. The wall is right in front of us, but we just freeze, right? And essentially the wall just keeps getting closer and closer and closer until it takes over us, right? And that's how numbness is created. We just freeze. We're in bed all day. We can't get up. We can't even do simple things like brush our teeth, shower, right? Because all of our pain is just coming back for us, but we're freezing. We're just completely just shutting down, right? And essentially just becoming like a skeleton in a coffin, because we feel our pain is too much, but we don't try to fight it or run away. We just freeze. But still, that is still technically a form of not necessarily running away, but it kind of is, because you're just watching it and letting it take over you, and basically that's how identification with pain happens, because you hit it, right? You fight it so much, you fight it so much, but sometimes when you see it, you just freeze, right? You don't know what to do, you don't know how to act, and you just shut down. You become totally numb, right? And that's when the trauma just takes over, and that's how a lot of people turn to alcohol, turn to living a sorry life, and being sad all the time, because they don't want to accept their pain. They don't know how to, right? So that is the first trauma response. Now the second trauma response is you lose hope for the future. Now a lot of times after trauma has happened, right, a lot of us may have went through a lot, and when we were going through that, the pain wasn't as bad as until after, right? Especially if your trauma is from your childhood, you had a traumatic childhood. It only gets really bad if you never heal when you're an adult, and all of that stuff starts to come back for you, and you start to live in regret, because you realize now you lived your whole life, or almost half of your life, and you haven't done shit that still is here for you, right? And that's how it just gets worse and worse over the years. Like, if you notice people who don't heal, they seem to get worse, or not necessarily in a negative way, but they end up triggering themselves, because they're just not facing their pain, and they just go through so much that they don't care anymore, right? And a lot of times we don't care in a way that we have no hope for the future. We have no hope for our goals. We think that this pain is never gonna go away. But that is essentially identifying with the pain. See, all these things are forms of identifying with the pain, because if you're letting the pain control you, if you're letting the past control you, then you're forever gonna be stuck with that pain. You're forever gonna be stuck with that past trauma. It's like a relationship. If you're gonna let that abuser control you, you're forever gonna be stuck with that abuser. But if you just take a step back and stop caring what they think, and really just get them out of your mind, get them out of your life totally, not by necessarily avoiding them, but just focus on you and realize that you are you are not them. They don't have to be in your life and completely control over your life. Then that's the only time that you'll be able to let go of your abuser. And that's just one example, right? But a lot of times through trauma, a common trauma response is we lose hope for the future, because we feel like this pain is never gonna end, right? And that ties back to the first common trauma response, because we feel like it's never gonna end, so we just basically identify with it and fight it, right? And eventually we start fighting it because we feel like it's never gonna end, so we just try to fight it so hard, or just completely avoid it, or just freeze when it keeps coming back for us, which causes us to be more and more numb, more and more depressed, and forever just keep getting more and more sad. But life can always get better, especially when recovering from trauma. So that is the second trauma response. Now the third trauma response, the third common trauma response, is that your dreams affect real life. A lot of us are dealing with the past. We're dealing with the hard past that's coming back for us now, right? And that essentially is brain damage in the hippocampus, the part of the brain that helps us differentiate the past and the now, right? A lot of our past becomes the now. A lot of our past moments comes back to now, whether that's through an emotion, through a certain event or a certain perception of how people are acting or treating you, or the past basically just comes to now, right? A total identification with your pain, right? Because you're living now, you might be in a safe place, but it still feels like you're over there, right? You're here, but it still feels like you're over there, back there in the past, right? And a lot of times when we have nightmares, right? A lot of times from trauma, nightmares can be so vivid and so harsh sometimes, because our dreams essentially are part of the mind, right? It's part of our subconscious. But when you're having a dream, it seems so vivid. It's like watching TV and getting really deep inside a movie, except this movie is coming from your brain. It's not coming from an external part of life, right? So dreams are very powerful in that sense, because dreams can seem so vivid, especially from a traumatic event, right? And we have a traumatic dream of our past. A dream can just necessarily be a memory formed into a dream, right? A memory of a person coming back into a dream and you doing things, right? That could also be a form of self-blame. You're in the dream and you have memories, and instead of doing what you actually did in that situation, you do what you would have done now, right? So dreams can affect your real life, and a lot of times when we have these nightmares, these dreams, we wake up feeling triggered, right? We wake up feeling yucky, dirty. We're ashamed of ourselves, right? And like I said, that's a form of self-blame, because our dreams essentially affect our day-to-day life. So we're blaming ourselves for having that dream, or doing something in that dream, or going through that dream and existing in that dream, right? We're blaming ourselves for our existence through that trauma when dreams affect our real life, because we don't want to accept the reality, right? We don't want to accept that now can be a time to heal. It's really hard to tell what's normal when going through a healing process, because you can't tell if what you're going through is right or wrong. You're always confused. Especially when children go through neglect, they're always confused. They don't know if people are going to be there for them. They have trust issues. Right? It's the same thing for dreams, right? When dreams affect you in your real life, that's a common trauma response, because your dreams, that's essentially basically just a trigger, because you had a memory of someone and now you wake up. You don't want to wake up, right? You don't want to start your day and you can't, because you're just frozen, you're paralyzed, you're numb. You feel bad, right? So that is the third common trauma response, that your dreams affect your real life. Now the fourth common trauma response is that your body feels like a hurricane or an empty pool at times, right? Now, a lot of times, either we have so much energy or we have no energy at all, right? Balance is never being able to be found a lot of times when we're healing. It's very hard to find that, especially just immediately, right? Balance sometimes can take a long time to find through the healing process and recovery from trauma, right? And a lot of times, for me even, I experienced this, is that a lot of times I either have a lot of energy or no energy at all, right? I'm still seeking and finding balance, right? So when my body feels like a hurricane, I feel like so much anxiety that my anxiety starts to pour out onto my body. And that essentially is what happens when we have so much anxiety. Like I said, there's only so much the human mind can handle, because the brain and mind are two very, very different things, right? Belief systems are created, right? And then from belief systems comes thoughts, and from thoughts comes feelings. That's what goes on in the mind, right? So we have a self-belief system of, oh, it's my fault, right? Or self-belief system of, oh, why did I go through that? And we're creating anxiety for ourselves, right? Eventually those feelings become so overstimulating that they start to pour out onto our body, right? And we can't even think through those moments. We start to get muscle spasms, right? You start to freeze, you start to feel like a hurricane, you start to feel super tense, right? Your veins start popping, you start sweating, right? You feel like a hurricane, right? And essentially this is what happens to the body, right, during a trigger. If it's not your mind, a lot of times it's your body. When your body starts to feel like a hurricane, this is essentially what happens throughout the trigger, and a lot of times after the trigger, you crash, right? And this feeling is like an empty pool, right? You just feel dry, you feel yucky, you don't feel energized, you feel numb, you feel like tightened up, like blocked up, and you feel like you can't move, you feel like you're so tense and so tight in your body, all your muscles tight that essentially your muscles are just fading away, right? Because they become so tight that they just have to dissolve in an unhealthy way, right? And you just feel dry, you don't feel like you have real energy, you don't feel like an actual human being that's functioning, right? And that essentially is how bad numbness can actually get. So that is a common trauma response, because you're getting triggered within the body. And a lot of times the body can feel like a hurricane, because it feels like so much is going on a lot of times when we have anxiety. When we have an anxiety attack, so much is going on. It feels like we're panicking, we're hyper aware. That eventually that hyper awareness pours out onto our body. And when that happens, we start to have so much tightness and too much energy for the body to handle. It essentially becomes an overstimulation in the brain, to the point where the brain just has to shut off for a while, right? Or the body has to shut off for a while. It's like in Get Out when he falls into the sunken place, right? He's being so hypnotized and facing all this pain that eventually, as soon as the psycho mom clinks her glass, he falls, right? Because as soon as she stops talking to him and brings him back to awareness, he falls, right? That's the same thing what happens to the body a lot of times, right? We go through so much pain in our body that we essentially faint or lose sensations, right, in our body, right? The pain goes up and then it crashes down, except for trauma response, when the pain goes up and it crashes back down, that crash really hurts us, because essentially it's the trigger going super high, reaching its peak, and then you just crash and now you're numb and fucked up, right? So that is the fourth common trauma response. Now the fifth and last common trauma response is that you blame yourself and you view yourself negatively because of these self-blaming tendencies. Now, a lot of times when we go through trauma, right, we don't recognize normality, like I've been saying. We don't recognize what's normal. We don't recognize what we actually went through was terrible, and it's having a toll on us now, right? That's how also coping mechanisms are created, again, because we don't want to accept the fact that we actually went through something, right? So we just want to put it to the side. I'll say that's bullshit. Depression doesn't exist for me. But depression can hit anybody. Even if you're healthy and healed, you can still go through depression. Pain will always be pain. Trauma will always be trauma. Depression will always just be depression, right? But it's really all about finding the root of the problem, right? And a lot of times the root of the problem is that we blame ourselves, right? And that's what's stopping us from even starting the healing process, because we feel like it's our fault, so we're essentially just harming ourselves. We're not trying to heal, right? Because we hate ourselves from going through something, and that's what oftentimes happens for sexual assault survivors and, you know, physical, all types of abuse survivors and victims who went through that type of stuff oftentimes blame themselves, right? People who are in abusive relationships, right, blame themselves, saying, oh, why didn't I leave any earlier? Why was I there? They always question it, right? But the real question is, why do you question it? Because essentially questioning it is like trying to find a way to fix it, but you can't fix the past. The past happened, right? The people who affected you may or may not accept their faults, but there's always something better out there. You can always leave, and it is hard, right? People who go through abusive relationships don't realize that this is abnormal. They don't have the same views as people on the outside of them, on the outside of the relationship, right? Because they're actually in the relationship, right? They may not want to accept the fact that this person is not good for them because they may love them and want to love them, but they can't, right? And realizing that can be hard, right? So it's not your fault, right? Everybody finds their time. Some people find their time when they're 30. I was lucky to find my time at 16, right? Some people find their healing process later in life at 50, but it's never too late to start your healing process, because once you start, it can only get better if you're doing things right, right? Because you only blame yourself and view yourself negatively because you have self-hatred for the fact that you went through that, right? You don't want to accept the fact that that is not what you went through. But doing that is like saying, if I accept it, then it has to be me, right? So that's essentially a fight or flight response. Either you want all of it or just run and completely avoid it, right? It's like an all or none response too, right? So you blame yourself because you don't accept the pain, right? Blaming yourself is a coping strategy, a defense mechanism, saying, oh, it wasn't them, oh, I didn't go through that, it was really just me perceiving the wrong way, right? It was my fault, right? You end up saying sorry to the person who actually caused all the damage onto you. You're the first person who ends up saying sorry, right? But how is that supposed to work? So the fifth common trauma response is that you blame yourself and you view yourself so negatively. Like, I suck, why did I go through this, right? Because a lot of times when we're reacting from trauma, right, we hear voices of certain people that may have caused us trauma, right? We hear voices, we hear things in our head, right, that are telling us this in a reaction to our trauma, saying, oh, I suck, or damn, why did that just happen, or damn, why did I just go through that, I suck now, right? It's always a question then an answer, right? But you're the one giving the answer. But really, what you should do is just embrace the pain, and all the questions will just go away, right? You won't have any questions, you won't have any crazy beliefs developing about life, about yourself, right? You'll just be able to live life and just be at peace when you stop blaming yourself, right? And accept your pain, right? Because that's really how simple it is, even though it can seem so complex, right? Really just gotta get down to the basics and embrace the pain, right? Because the more simple the healing process is, the more easygoing it is. So yeah, but that's it for the video. Those are 5 common trauma responses that everybody goes through.